Today's episode of What's the Big Idea is brought to you by Curiosity. Oh, yeah, Curiosity. Right now, my listeners can get a free, surefire way to brighten their day. Just try learning something new. Follow your curiosity and learn something because you want to, not because you have to. Curiosity. Check it out. And now on to the show. Welcome to today's episode of What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. Later in the episode, I'll be joined by Zach Groeschel, a teacher in Nanjing, China, to discuss what he's learned about education research during his PhD program. Dear listener, follow me on a little thought journey. Think back to your most recent lesson. Walk through that lesson step by step. What were you doing? What were your students doing? Taking a test, writing an essay, working in groups? Were you giving instruction or guiding them in independent work? Probably many of those things all in the same lesson. Okay, so how did you decide on the course of that lesson? Past experience? Lessons from your teacher training? Advice from a colleague? Sample lessons in a textbook? Something you read in a research study? Okay, not to belabor this here, but my point is that we teachers draw from a wide range of sources to create a wide range of lesson plans. I want to talk today about the influence, or lack thereof, of education research on that planning. And don't get me wrong, I'm not about to subject you to a literature review, nor am I going to recite a long list of random controlled trials and their conclusions. Rather, I want to ask this question. Should educators and administrators actively seek to include evidence-based practices in their planning and instruction? And if so, to what degree? Evidence is a common word heard in classrooms. We teachers say things like, use more evidence in your essay. This lab report needs more evidence. We encourage students to support their ideas with facts, details, examples, in short, evidence. We tell them that a well-informed opinion is superior to an ill-informed opinion. We scaffold and model ways of inserting evidence into their writing, oral presentations, projects, etc. But how often do we apply that same lesson to our own teaching? Do our lesson and unit plans contain evidence? How often do we ask, is my teaching influenced by evidence? What is evidence anyway? So a quick note here about what I mean by evidence. Later on, I'll be asking my guest for a more precise definition, but for now, suffice to say that evidence is what's collected in research studies on education, maybe on pedagogy or curriculum, classroom relationships, anything. And those studies are then reviewed by other academics to verify their validity. And these studies often have titles like, to what extent and under which circumstances are growth mindsets important to academic achievement? To meta-analysis. In other words, they're not always inviting to the layman, or rather lay teacher. The idea of evidence-based teaching practices is nothing new, but the internet has given rise to a virtual cottage industry of teachers, policymakers, and commentators strongly advocating for more evidence-based practices in schools. If you've spent any time perusing blogs and social media, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For example, I came across this recently in a blog. Teachers should be using evidence-based practices in their classroom, and educational fads, myths, and folklore have kept teaching relegated to a semi-profession while simultaneously increasing student inequity. Whoa. This recent surge in interest can largely be traced to Tom Bennett, a teacher and education commentator in the UK who helped launch Research Ed, a burgeoning movement in the UK complete with conferences and its own magazine. Recent conferences in the US show the growing spread and interest in this field. Bennett said recently, I like to see teaching as an evidence-supported practice. I think teaching is very experiential and craft-based. It is, however, as something that happens in the physical world, amenable to structured study, and different types of research can tell us different things. One prominent skeptic of the use of research in education is Alfie Kohn, a progressive author, lecturer, and general shit-stirrer. He writes, quote, It's particularly important to distinguish between relying on scientific techniques to investigate the natural world and relying on them in education, which is ultimately about understanding, responding to, and helping particular individuals. Even studies with reasonable criteria for evaluating the success of an intervention should be applied with caution because on average findings, however reliable and valid, may not apply to every student. Close quote. Another strong criticism comes from an essay written by author and filmmaker Carol Black in 2016. It's very lengthy, but it's a worthwhile read in which Black makes the argument that the evidence-based crowd is misusing research in an effort to marginalize progressive practices and further entrench traditional teacher-centered learning. She writes, quote, "This is a new phenomenon that we're seeing with increasing frequency in popular media claims about science. We're all familiar by now with the strategies of those who have tried to deny the scientific consensus about climate change. But what we're seeing now in many issues is the reverse strategy, the claim there is scientific consensus where there is no such thing, that an open, ongoing area of scientific inquiry has reached a settled conclusion, and that anyone who disagrees about this is as irrational and anti-science as a climate denier or a believer in Bigfoot." Unquote. Okay, so to summarize, there are those calling for a hell of a lot more evidence-based practices in the classroom, claiming that to do otherwise is irresponsible. While on the other hand, there are those arguing that while scientific study and research in education is important, we must be very careful about how far we take it. And a good example of this battlefield is the debate over learning styles and whether or not students benefit from learning in their preferred way. Well, I don't know about you, listener, but all this leaves me with a lot of questions. Is research-based evidence truly applicable in the classroom? If so, to what degree? And if so, how can I, average teacher, really discern what research is valuable? I'm no expert on research. I'm not even an amateur. I'm best described as a curious practitioner seeking ways to improve my craft. So this felt like the perfect time to call Zach Rochelle. Zach teaches design for grades 1 through 5 at an international school in Nanjing, China. He's taught in the US, Vietnam, and Sudan. He is also in his third year of a PhD program in education with a specialization in instructional design for online learning. Thus, he has one foot in the classroom and one in the research world, and I thought he could speak to these questions I've had. I was not disappointed. As you'll hear, Zach's responses and perspective are really valuable and insightful, and despite his best humble efforts to argue the contrary, he truly comes off as an expert. I started off asking Zach to talk about his own teacher training.
Well, I mean, I went through sort of I'm American. I'm from Washington State, so I got my certificate like many people do, but mine was part of a master's. So I got my master's at the same time as my certificate, and I think during that we had some sort of discussion postings and assignments that required citing the readings. Never really required digging deep into actual articles, peer-reviewed articles from journals. When I finally did my culminating project for that master's, there was like an annotated bibliography sort of assignment in which we had to use our school's databases to search for articles. But really, it wasn't really like they were checking, I think, how the quality of those articles, or really needing us to be teacher researchers at that point. So most of everything I've done for research up until now has been in my own time, and then since I've started my PhD.
Okay. And you made reference, you used the phrase peer-reviewed. I wonder if you could take a second to define for our listeners, when we say research, what are we really talking about?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in research. As I said, I'm just in the middle of PhD coursework.
Mm-hmm.
But the gold standard for what we use and what's required at this level of coursework is peer-reviewed articles. And these are articles that have gone through sort of the rigorous process of other other researchers, other PhDs in the field who are experts or considered experts have read and have looked over this research and have sort of certified that as being a high quality study. That does not mean that all studies are high quality studies. And a lot of times I'm looking for research and I find something in particular, things that do not come out of the United States, things that come out of some countries that have doctoral programs that I think are not as developed as we have
Sure.
in the Western world, for example, or in China, Japan, which are very, very low quality. Even the English on them is low quality. And we're talking about, peer review is supposed to be the gold standard, but of course things get peer reviewed and are not very high quality.
Okay. Got that. So that you brought up a point I want to come back to about how do we tell if something's quality. So you're a PhD student. Congratulations, by the way, on attempting that. So maybe talk me through a bit. You got into the program. You started looking at research. How's that process been, and how did it change your perspective on education?
Well, it changed it in a lot of ways, and I think one thing I didn't know was I thought when I started the PhD, it would kind of feel like another master's, or maybe like a master's plus a dissertation, and it would take a long time. But the expectation for the kind of work we're doing and the kind of the burden of proof of finding information that's credible and citing everything that we say, the expectation is much higher. And so because I think of that experience, everything that I do as an educator, I think I look through it through that lens. I go, okay, I just did something, or I'm planning to do something. Is there anything in the literature, in the research literature that exists that either supports that or talks about it or speaks to it? And then from there, I kind of go through a research cycle of looking for articles, saving them onto my organization system, and then trying to build on my own personal knowledge.
Okay. And is there do you have a threshold, a personal threshold, or maybe a threshold that your instructors in your program have given you, where you can say, okay, I've seen enough articles, I've seen enough research that tells me this is something worth pursuing? How do you determine when something is valid based on what you're finding in the research?
I think that's at this point I haven't found a real good answer to that. I don't find myself someone that's very ideological in education, and I don't think that everything can be there's some people that I think take a positivist perspective or an objectivist perspective, which is that everything needs to be followed with evidence. And I'm sort of somewhere in the middle, I guess. Like, I don't need to count the amount of blades in my lawn to know it needs to be mowed. There are other ways that come from personal experience or just through plain reasoning that I find answers to my problems in the classroom. But sometimes when I find that I don't know where to go, or I've learned something and I want to pursue it further, it's where I go to research and I find, there's a lot of stuff on this. And actually, there's a pretty clear trend in this direction. And when I see that, I find that is something that can sort of inform my practice now. It doesn't mean that that's who I'm going to be for the rest of my career, but it's something I'm going to try now, implement now in my classroom.
Okay, that's very well said, and it actually leads me to one of my big questions. My next question: teachers who are maybe in that same spot that you said, I've hit a roadblock, or I've come to a question about my practice, and I really would love to know what the research says. But from your own experiences, from people you've worked with, teachers have very little free time often to spend on research. And what advice can you give to teachers who really want to get into the research to inform their practice and pursue those questions they have, but don't know where to start, or feel maybe overwhelmed by what they see on social media and on blogs?
First of all, I don't really think it's necessary teachers' responsibility to spend all their time trying to become researchers on their own. I think it's an extremely difficult task to be a teacher all on its own, to be a teacher and a researcher at the same time. I think it's hard to be a researcher. It's hard to be a teacher. I can't imagine trying to do both. A lot of what I do in terms, because I'm also pressed for time. I mean, my timetable teaching design technology is packed as a specialist teacher. I sort of go by that sort of 8-8-8 rule of 8 hours of work, 8 hours of play, 8 hours of sleep kind of thing. I don't not to bring home too much work, even though I have my PhD work. So I think a lot of the burden is on and the responsibility is on administrators to change how they do professional development, change how we do staff meetings, so that it's around research, that we're kind of professionalizing the conversations we have, that not everything that we're talking about is sort of clerical, when are grades, when is the next sports event thing, that it might be a little bit more academic and a little more sophisticated in terms of bringing in the research so that teachers can use it. And then, sorry, what was the first part of the question again? I just kind of went off on a thing.
Oh, no, that's excellent. No, it's really just about that. Where could teachers, let's say a teacher is, I think actually that you make a really great point there about the balance between teachers and administrators. Let's take a teacher who does want to maybe get into the research a bit. What would be a logical place to begin?
For me, it would be finding out where you can have access to a research database. And I'm talking about that search engine that has all of the peer-reviewed articles. There's a huge problem with educational research in that there's a paywall. If you ever try to find research on your own, you'll see the abstract come up on something like ProQuest or a ResearchGate or something like that, and then right below it says, "Would you like to pay for this article?"
Yeah, I've noticed.
Yeah, that happens for anyone who's not in a university or doesn't know where to get access to a research database. So my first thing would be, can I get access to it? And for example, I want to plug Tacoma Public Library in Washington, where I'm from. Their library system, you just go on, you have a library card, and you have access to all of their research databases for education. So there are free ways to do it. And then if you can't get access in that way, like your school doesn't give it to you, like my school does. We have EBSCOhost, for example. If your school doesn't give it to you, then I would say you need to use Google Scholar, which is like basically the next best thing.
Okay.
Google itself has a service that retrieves articles more or less almost as good. I guess it's like 70% of the yield you can get out of a database or something like that, in which it's pretty close to as good as you can get for free.
Okay. Excellent. Google Scholar. All right. And so a teacher goes in there and, is interested in looking up a particular particular idea. Maybe it's about teaching reading. Back to an idea that you brought up earlier, without, asking you to explain your entire PhD program here, but how does a layman look at an article and in a database or on Google Scholar and determine if it's something actually worth their time?
Yeah, and this is really where training needs to come in. I've proposed this at my school to start leading some trainings around databases, and I think it's going to go forward. But really, you need to understand how to use these databases in terms of how the search engine works. Google itself is so much more user-friendly than these research databases. But once you learn how to use the database and you plug in the correct terms and use sort of the right logic for that database, then my recommendation really is to read the abstract. Does the abstract, which is supposed to tell the entire article, does the abstract lead you to the knowledge that you are seeking? And if not, move on. I mean, there's no point in sort of digging through the methodology, the literature review, the data collection. Reading the abstract and then going straight to the conclusion, I think, is even best practice amongst researchers themselves.
Wow.
Once you're going into an article, don't waste your time digging further than the abstract and the conclusion or the discussion before you decide, do I read this whole thing?
Okay. That's really solid advice. What I wonder if you could give us an example of something that has been really helpful for you in your research that you've actually taken into the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I do has to do with problem solving. So I'm a design technology teacher. I mean, my room, if you're here, is just you looked around it. There's glue guns on the tables. There's saws and hammers and nails and things. So a lot of what I do has to do with getting student. How do we get students to problem solve around different objectives that I have? How do we get them to learn content from around the school, and how does that integrate into my subject? So, I mean, a lot of the research I've been doing is around problem solving. And we know that looking at problem solving from the literature, that when students know a lot more about what they're doing in terms of they've developed a deep wells of knowledge, that they're able to problem solve better than if they just use trial and error or use a really inefficient problem solving technique. So a lot of what I do is I try to front load a ton of information and get kids using basic explicit instruction at the beginning. And then once students have really developed that knowledge after 20, 30 minutes in a lesson, then we go and we tackle the tools. I've seen just from that, like I've seen a complete change in how I used to do it, which was just letting students touch everything and play with it. And what they were doing at that point is they were practicing persisting, practicing find things and finding ways to do it in their own way. And they weren't practicing what I was expecting or what I thought they should learn, which was the lesson objective wasn't being tackled at the same rate. So I mean, that's just a simple example of something that has come from the literature that I use a lot.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, and I should mention actually, right before we got in this call, I noticed that you posted something on Twitter, a student of yours with a saw, and there was some applause going on in the classroom. So it looked like great fun. I another question, one that comes to my mind a lot, and maybe you can help clarify this for me when I see research, that a lot of research is based on the results are based on quantitative factors, things that can be quantified, which to my view is often things like standardized tests or teacher created tests or grades, which always strikes me as, I'm not going to say superficial because it is, I don't want to delegitimize that research, but we teachers know there's so much to a learner and a test captures some of that. But do you agree with my view that research often is based on quantifiable information like tests? Am I seeing that correctly?
Well, I think there is definitely a large portion of the Twitter community and and educators in general who wish that everything could be proven quantifiably with quantitative data. Mm-hmm. It's funny that you say that because there's also a lot of people that I follow that are in research that fall on the other side of the spectrum, in which they think there's too much qualitative studies in educational research, that we have too much soft from case studies and from basic qualitative studies and phenomenologies and things like that basically are not really evidence-based in their viewpoint from their sort of paradigm of how learning and research works. So, I think that usually for me, hard data is a piece of information that I wish that soft data that comes from qualitative research would sort of answer. You go into my classroom, you observe, and you see what students are doing. You have a discussion with them and with me. That is sort of a way of trying to explain maybe something that a data point initially got you excited about, when you're a researcher. Do I think that everything in life can be, quantified or can we put a number to it in terms of standardized tests? I mean, some things can, we can try to find a way, some sort of methodology that can measure everything. If in terms of engagement, can we see how much that, what percentage of eye contact the student has with the teacher, or we can find ways to do it. And I think you can't really fully answer those questions until you have some descriptive data with it.
Okay, great. I really appreciate your perspective here. I do want to ask you one last question. Something you tweeted I think recently, a couple of weeks ago, maybe, and I just was curious to hear more about this. It was something to the effect of, you believe there's truth in education, and I wonder if you could explain what you meant by that. I was struck by that.
Um, I think it's our responsibility as educators to try to find answers in education. I don't subscribe to sort of the thinking that um, we we as educators we cannot find solutions. We can't design to try to achieve different things in education. That basically every learner is different, and because everything is so based on context, and that basically every year is starting over, and you have to try to figure it out through trial and error. For me, I think that there are some rules that we can follow. There's some things in the literature that can help us to generalize in terms of how we solve problems. So I think if we kind of take back this profession by learning more about the research, being just a little bit more of a, I think, a grown-up profession in terms of a bit more sophistication and how we learn and how we look at theory, I think that we can start seeing some of the patterns and trends in education, and that could help our practice. I don't think that it's possible in my lifetime to know the answer to everything, but I want to seek it.
What what's the elevator pitch you give to a school administrator about research?
I mean, teachers are yearning for information. Teachers want to feel like they are supporting their practice with evidence from research. I say, let's go start some PD experiences. Let's subscribe to an online research database, and let's give teachers the tools and the knowledge for how to use research now, because I think a lot of people are going to take advantage of it.
Zach Groeschel, I have to thank you 100 times over for joining me today. I know you're in the middle of your school day. It's noon there in Nanjing, and so I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Zach Groeschel. One big takeaway from this whole process for me is that it's not a question of should we use research or not. Clearly, education research has an important role to play in our planning and teaching. Even critics of the use of education research, such as Alfie Kohn, agree that scientific study of our profession is necessary. Zach made several good points in our conversation, especially about the use of time. He believes that it is the role of administration to provide teachers, who he says are yearning for information, with up-to-date research. Where I struggle is with the logistics. Who will pick out what research is read, and who will decide what research makes it to the teacher's PD? Zach discussed the need for training when reading research, but how many administrators have that kind of training? And what I would worry about is something that Zach and I didn't get into, and that's confirmation bias. I'm sure if you use social media or you follow social media, you know what I mean here. People are drawn to ideas that confirm what they already believe. And my worry when looking at education research is that schools, teachers, administrators will be drawn to the research that confirms what that school is already doing. There's such a great value in looking at other perspectives and other ideas. And I just would hate for research to be abused and used as a tool for teachers and administrators to simply reinforce the status quo. If you're on Twitter, I highly recommend checking out Zach Groeschel. He's at Mr. Zach G. And his first name is spelled Z-A-C-H, at Mr. Zach G. If you listen to my conversation and you know that getting into a database or Google Scholar just isn't for you, but you are interested in keeping abreast of ideas and research in education, I have one resource I'd like to recommend. It's called the Marshall Memo. It's produced by a retired teacher named Kim Marshall, and every Monday he writes a brief summary of articles and research about education from around the world and around the web. He then sends to your email a tidy PDF with his summaries and links, and it is a really awesome resource. I look forward to it every week. It's short and to the point, and it's a great way of staying informed without having to invest too much time. It's only $50 for the year, and that gives you access to all his past memos. Go to marshallmemo.com. Thanks for checking out this episode of What's the Big Idea? As always, Pierce Murphy has our music covered, courtesy of the Free Music Archive, and I leave you with Zach Rochelle discussing some of the reasons he loves teaching overseas. Thanks for listening.
Well, yeah, I mean, international teaching, I think for an educator that feels that their life is stale, they want to go travel, they want to make a little more money, they want to feel a totally different vibe than the standardized testing-based sort of culture of U.S. schools, I really would say give it a try. I started in Vietnam, was my first international school after teaching the U.S. Then from Vietnam, I went to my first IB school, which is in Sudan. And after some great times there, now I'm in China. And it's probably just going to keep doing this for forever.
Yeah.
The student body of all the schools I've been at have been just incredible. The learning community is, I think, really elevated. They listen to things like this about research, and I'm not saying that doesn't happen in the US either, but I think I have a lot more time. Teachers here have a lot more time on their hands in terms of planning, in terms of just enjoying working as a teacher and feeling like a professional. So there's a lot more like responsiveness to stuff like this.
There's no hope for compromise. It's black as American coal. As our heads in the headlines.